There's a photograph from 1919 that still exists. A 33-ton German tank hauled through the streets of Brisbane by two steamrollers, gouging the roads as it moved, buildings scraped. 11 hours to travel less than 2 miles. And nobody could explain how this thing ended up here. A weapon built in Germany, abandoned in France, shipped halfway around the world to a city that had nothing to do with the war except send its sons to fight in it. The whole thing sounds like a fever dream, a monstrous steel box, 24 feet long, bristling with guns, painted with the name of a demon, suddenly appearing in colonial Brisbane like someone misdelivered the mail. But Mephisto didn't roll to Australia. Someone decided it should. And that decision, made by a Queensland battalion commander standing in the mud of northern France in 1918, is why you can still see this tank today. The only surviving German A7V on Earth. Not in Berlin, not in a European museum, in Canberra. In a building most people walk past without realising what's inside. This is the story of how Australia captured, shipped and preserved the last A7V, a century-long journey that was more improbable than the battle itself. On 24th of April 1918, Lieutenant Heinz Theunissen was having a very bad morning. His tank, A7V number 506, had been assigned to the German attack on Villers-Bretonneux. The vehicle was massive, 33 tons. A crew of 18 men packed inside a steel box that offered almost no visibility and generated enough heat to make men pass out. And Theunissen had named it himself, because it was fashionable among German tank crews to christen their vehicles with names from mythology and literature. He chose Mephisto, the devil from Goethe's Faust, the tempter, the dealmaker. He'd received the vehicle in late December 1917 or early January 1918. By April, he knew its quirks, its strengths, its flaws. And the A7V had plenty of flaws. The most dangerous one was invisible until it killed you. The driver and commander sat approximately 5 meters above the ground, perched high in the vehicle's superstructure for a commanding view of the battlefield. Sounds like an advantage. It wasn't. That elevated position created a blind spot of 10 to 11 meters directly in front of the tank. The driver literally could not see the ground immediately ahead. In the chaos of combat, smoke, shell bursts, fog, dust, this design flaw turned the battlefield into a minefield of invisible obstacles. Shell craters, trenches, steep slopes, pits. Many A7Vs came to grief simply because their drivers couldn't see where they were going. Mephisto would be one of them. The attack started before dawn. Mephisto was part of the second group of A7Vs, with specific objectives to capture Monument Farm. The French called it Ferme de la Couture, along with Monument Wood and the Bois d'Aquin, all south of Villers-Bretonneux. The German tank program was plagued by problems: supply shortages, competing priorities, bureaucratic delays that had prevented Germany from producing tanks in meaningful numbers. By comparison, Britain and France manufactured thousands. Germany managed 20. Total. The A7V was less a weapon than an experiment. And experiments fail. Mephisto would fail that day. The tank was rolling toward Monument Farm when the fuel line clogged. The engine sputtered, died. The vehicle ground to a halt, while other tanks in the formation kept moving, disappearing into the smoke and chaos ahead. Theunissen and some of his crew dismounted, advancing on foot to help with an infantry assault on the farmhouse, leaving the remaining men to fix the blockage. By the time they got the engine running again, they were alone on the battlefield. Theunissen ordered the driver to speed up, catch the formation. The driver pushed the throttle forward, and the tank lurched ahead through the smoke. Visibility was almost nothing. The elevated cabin that was supposed to provide commanding views showed only chaos, explosions, drifting smoke, the uncertain shapes of the battlefield. And that 10-metre blind spot ahead. Then an artillery shell exploded directly in front of them. The blast carved a crater into the earth. The driver couldn't see it, never had a chance to see it. The tank pitched forward into the hole, its nose diving into the mud, 33 tons of steel suddenly stuck at an angle that made extraction impossible with the equipment on hand. The crew tried everything. Nothing worked. With Allied shells falling around them and no hope of recovery, they stripped the tank according to standard operational practice, removing machine guns, essential equipment, anything that might be useful to the enemy, and abandoned it. Lieutenant Theunissen and his crew escaped on foot, leaving Mephisto stuck in its crater behind German lines. The tank sat there for nearly 3 months. Here's the thing about that abandoned tank. The Allies knew it was there. French reconnaissance planes photograph the battlefield regularly. You can see Mephisto in those aerial shots if you know where to look. A small pixelated dot in the ruins of an orchard called Monument Wood. The tank sat in its crater behind German lines, just barely behind them. The German trenches ran to the north of the wood and attached farm, which meant anyone approaching from the Allied side drew immediate fire. Close enough to see, impossible to reach. The tank was exposed to everything the war could throw at it. Repeated shelling from both sides widened the crater. Mephisto sank deeper into the ground. Rain filled the hole. The metal began to rust. And still it sat there, a 33-ton prize that neither side could claim. On the 9th of July 1918, men from the Australian 28th Battalion stumbled across it during operations in Monument Wood. They got close enough to confirm it was real, a German tank, abandoned, largely intact. Then German rifles opened up from the trenches to the north, and they had to fall back. They couldn't even conduct a thorough inspection. The tactical situation simply didn't permit it. 5 days later, everything changed. The 26th Battalion, mostly Queenslanders, some Tasmanians, took over that section of the front on the night of 13th July 1918. They soon completed the occupation of Monument Wood. And on 14th July 1918, Lieutenant H.F. Pearson, the battalion's diarist, wrote the words that would set everything in motion. During the attack, the battalion captured the derelict German tank, number 506 Mephisto. Pearson noted something important in that diary entry. Aside from some damage to its roof and ammunition store, Mephisto was structurally intact. Not destroyed, not stripped to the frame. Intact. A complete German tank sitting in a hole, waiting for someone to decide what to do with it. That someone was Lieutenant Colonel James Alexander Robinson. Robinson commanded the 26th Battalion, and when he inspected Mephisto, stuck in its crater, battered by months of shelling, half buried in mud, he didn't see scrap metal worth leaving behind. He saw history. Robinson believed this was the first German tank ever captured by the Allies, an artifact of a new kind of warfare that had only existed for 2 years, a machine that Germany had barely managed to build and that would never be built again once the war ended. Robinson was determined that the tank should be acquired as a historical specimen, not scrapped, not left to rot, not abandoned to become another piece of battlefield debris. But Robinson couldn't authorize a recovery operation on his own. The tank was still within sight of German positions, still within small arms range. Any extraction attempt would require significant resources, vehicles, men, artillery support, coordination with British tank crews who had the heavy equipment necessary to tow 33 tons of steel. That meant going up the chain of command. He took his case to Brigadier Evan Alexander Wisdom, who commanded the 7th Brigade. Robinson made practical arguments. The hull could shelter advancing German soldiers if they recaptured the area. Leaving it there gave the enemy an asset. The Germans might attempt to recover or repurpose the vehicle themselves, if given time. But he also made a competitive argument that probably carried more weight. If the Australians didn't take Mephisto, the British definitely would. This wasn't paranoia. Another A7V called Elfrida had already been captured by French and British troops, overturned but still functional, the first A7V to fall into Allied hands. The British had recovered it. The British were examining it. If there was glory and intelligence value in captured German tanks, the British were already claiming their share. And Mephisto, stuck in a sector held by Queenslanders, discovered by Australians, formerly captured in the 26th Battalion's diary, was sitting there, waiting to be taken by whoever had the resources and the will to do it. Robinson wanted that to be Queensland. Wisdom approved the operation. The man who would later be promoted to general and decorated with the CB, CMG and DSO, signed off on one of the war's most unusual recovery missions. Not primarily for tactical advantage, for history, and for Queensland. Getting Mephisto out of that crater would prove to be one of the most dangerous missions any of these men had ever undertaken. The problem wasn't the tank, it was geography. The vehicle was still within small arms range of German lines. Any recovery attempt in daylight was suicide. And even at night, the noise of moving a 33-ton object would alert every German soldier within earshot. They'd call in artillery. They'd direct fire on the recovery party. Men would die. On the 15th of July 1918, Lieutenant Pearson took 3 officers from the British 1st Gun Carrier Company to inspect the vehicle and assess whether extraction was even feasible. They crawled through the darkness, examined Mephisto in its crater, and came back with an honest assessment. It could be done. But it was too dangerous given the proximity of German positions. The Germans were simply too close. So the 26th Battalion was ordered to push them back. Not for tactical advantage, not to capture territory, to create a buffer zone that would allow them to extract a single abandoned tank. Over the following days, Australian forces conducted what they called peaceful penetration, a deliberately ironic term for small attacks, raids on enemy outposts, pressure operations designed to shove the German line northward, metre by metre. These weren't major offensives. They were sharp, targeted operations against specific positions, outposts, listening posts, forward trenches that gave the Germans observation over Monument Wood. Each raid was dangerous. Each pushed the line back slightly. Each created more breathing room between the stranded tank and the German rifles. The men conducting these raids didn't know they were doing it for a tank. Most of them probably never learned the full story. They were just following orders that had been shaped, ultimately, by Robinson's determination to recover a piece of history before someone else claimed it. By 22nd July 1918, the operation was authorised. Lieutenant A.J. Mutton, reconnaissance officer of the Gun Carrier Company, surveyed the route and selected the path the evacuation should take. Working parties from the 26th Battalion spent the nights of 20th and 21st July clearing debris, filling shell holes, removing obstacles. They were building a road through no man's land. A road for one vehicle, one trip. The Australian infantrymen couldn't operate heavy equipment themselves. That would fall to the British tank crews. But their role was critical. Filling the shell holes in the transport route, removing obstacles, covering and muffling the tank tracks to prevent noise that might alert German forces, applying grease to facilitate movement. The route itself was surveyed and decided by a British officer, but the labour and the security were Australian. 13 men volunteered for the actual recovery operation. Everyone understood this might be a one-way mission. The night of 23rd to 24th July 1918 started badly and got worse. Around midnight, the recovery party moved into position. 2 British gun carriers, essentially tanks modified as heavy tractors, would provide the pulling power. The 13 Australian volunteers would handle the groundwork, attaching cables, removing debris, applying grease to Mephisto's tracks to reduce friction. An aircraft flew low overhead to mask the noise of the operation. Allied artillery conducted sporadic shelling for the same reason, random bombardments designed to cover the sounds of metal scraping through mud. They reached the tank, started working, and then the Germans opened fire. Not bullets, gas shells. An apparently pre-planned bombardment that forced every man in the recovery party to don gas masks. The masks were suffocating, clumsy things that limited vision to almost nothing. Communication became nearly impossible. You couldn't shout through the rubber, couldn't hear over the bombardment. And these men had to keep working anyway, in the dark, under chemical attack, attaching steel cables to a tank they could barely see. They hooked the cable to Mephisto. The gun carriers engaged their engines. The cable went taut, and the tank lurched free of its crater. For 4 kilometres, 2.5 miles, they dragged the 33-ton vehicle westward through the night, past shell craters, around debris, through terrain that had been fought over for months, that was pocked with holes and littered with the wreckage of war. The noise was incredible, metal grinding, engines straining, and all of it happening under gas masks, with German shells still falling around them. When they finally reached the temporary cover of But, they weren't finished. They obscured the trail left by the tank's caterpillar tracks, the deep ruts that would be visible from the air. They laid a false trail in another direction, hoping to mislead German reconnaissance aircraft who might spot the marks at dawn. All 13 Australian volunteers who participated in the recovery ended up in hospital. Gas exposure, every single one of them. 2 of them suffered gunshot wounds to the head during the operation, injuries sustained while dragging a tank through the darkness while being bombarded with gas shells. All of them survived. Mephisto was free. What happened next is almost harder to believe than the recovery itself. From But, the tank was moved by stages to the 5th Tank Brigade training ground at Vaux-en-Amiénois. There, Allied intelligence officers crawled over every inch of it. They measured dimensions, studied construction techniques, documented armour thickness and gun placements. Mephisto was a treasure trove of intelligence about German armoured warfare capabilities. But the soldiers left their marks too. The hull became a canvas. Names were scratched into the armour, quotes, drawings, unit insignia. Countless soldiers recorded their presence on this captured trophy, turning the German tank into an Allied artefact covered in graffiti from soldiers of multiple nations. The most prominent piece of artwork, someone painted a large British lion with a crown, its right paw resting on an A7V, directly onto the hull. The conqueror and the conquered. A symbol painted in defiance, celebrating victory over German armoured warfare. Meanwhile, other A7Vs met different fates. The Germans had sent a demolition team to attempt to destroy an A7V called Nixe to prevent it being used by the Allies. Elfriede, the first A7V captured, had been recovered by French and British troops and was being examined elsewhere. But neither of those tanks was claimed by Australian forces. Neither had a Queensland connection. Neither would survive the decades to come. Mephisto did. and that connection would determine everything. The journey from battlefield to Brisbane covered more than 10,000 miles and required coordination between military organisations, transport systems and governments across 3 continents. From Vaux-en-Amiénois, the tank was transported to the Tank Corps Gunnery School at Merlimont, the first step in a journey that would span the globe. The tank remained there until early October 1918, while the war continued around it and technical officers completed their assessments. Then, during October, Mephisto was moved to Poulainville, a short distance from the original recovery location. Then the movement continued, north again, to Dunkirk, the French port closest to England. At Dunkirk, Mephisto was loaded onto a ship for the crossing of the English Channel, London on the far side, and from London, transport to Tilbury Docks on the Thames estuary, the major port for vessels heading to Australia and the far reaches of the British Empire. On April 2nd, 1919, Mephisto was loaded onto the SS Armagh. The ship was carrying 1,423 returning Anzac troops, Australian and New Zealand soldiers going home after years of war. Men who had survived the trenches, the gas, the shells, the mud. And somewhere in the hold, secured against the pitch and roll of the ocean, sat a 33-ton German tank, a souvenir of everything they'd endured. The route took them around the world. The SS Armagh went west, Tilbury to Plymouth on England's southern coast, then south down the Atlantic, past the coast of Africa, around the Cape of Good Hope at the continent's southern tip. A stop in Cape Town for supplies and coal. Then Durban, further up the African coast on the Indian Ocean side. From Durban, the long crossing. Thousands of miles of empty water stretching between Africa and Australia. Days of nothing but ocean and sky. The ship rising and falling with the swells. The 33-ton tank shifting in the hold despite whatever securing methods the crew had improvised. Then finally, land. Adelaide first, on Australia's southern coast, down to Melbourne, and finally northeast along the Australian coast toward Brisbane, following the curve of Queensland's coastline to the capital city that had sent so many of its sons to the war. 65 days of sailing. 2 months and 5 days. The SS Armagh entered the Brisbane River in early June 1919, with different records giving dates of 2nd June, 6th June or 14th June, depending on whether they're marking the ship's arrival, the tank's unloading, or the completion of wharfside procedures. 10,000 miles. A tank that had travelled further after its abandonment than it ever did under its own power. Mephisto arrived at Norman Wharf on the Brisbane River, roughly where the Eagle Street Pier ferry wharf sits in modern Brisbane, near the intersection of Creek Street and Eagle Street. The wharf was designed for cargo ships carrying wool and wheat and manufactured goods, not for war trophies weighing as much as a loaded train car. A special crane was required to lift the tank from the ship's hold. Brisbane in 1919 didn't have equipment designed for 33-ton loads. Someone had to improvise. The lift itself was a spectacle. This massive steel box, painted with the name Mephisto and a crowned lion, swinging through the air above the Brisbane River before being lowered onto Australian soil for the first time. Think about this moment. A colonial city that had sent its young men to fight in a war half a world away. A city that had read about tanks in newspapers, seen photographs maybe, but never witnessed one in person. And now a German weapon, captured by Queenslanders, shipped 10,000 miles, arriving on a vessel crowded with returning soldiers, was being lowered onto the Brisbane docks by crane. The future was arriving in physical form. The war, which had seemed so distant despite its casualties, was suddenly present. The tank sat at Norman Wharf for over 2 months while officials figured out what to do with it. Then, on 22nd of August 1919, they moved it. The destination was the Queensland Museum at Gregory Terrace in Bowen Hills. Locals called it the Old Museum Building. The distance was less than 2 miles. It took 11 hours. Brisbane didn't have vehicles capable of towing 33 tonnes through city streets. The Brisbane City Council loaned 2 steamrollers, heavy road-building machines powered by steam engines, among the most powerful pulling devices in the entire city. These were machines designed to flatten roads, not to tow tanks. Workers hooked them to Mephisto with chains and cables, and they started dragging. The tank's caterpillar tracks bit into the road surface. Every block left ruts gouged into the pavement. Brisbane's streets weren't designed for this. They were designed for horses, for carts, for the occasional automobile, not for a 33-ton war machine being hauled by steamroller. The vehicle's width exceeded what the streets could accommodate. As it was manoeuvred around corners, its sides scraped against buildings. Facades were damaged, walls were scarred. The whole operation was a slow-motion disaster of infrastructure destruction, inching forward block by block, hour after hour, while Brisbane watched. Workers walking alongside, curious residents gathering at corners, children running to keep up with the world's slowest parade. 11 hours, less than 2 miles, an average speed of about 500 feet per hour, slower than a person could crawl. But it worked. When Mephisto finally arrived at the Queensland Museum, workers positioned it in the garden, outside, under the open sky, and there it would stay for more than 60 years. This is where the story most people know begins, the story that lives in memory. For more than 60 years, Mephisto sat outdoors in the Brisbane climate, subtropical heat that could crack paint and warp metal, humidity that settled into every joint and seam, monsoonal rains that fell in sheets, pooled on the hull, seeped into the interior, year after year after year. The weather ate at it. Paint flaked away in patches, exposing bare metal to the elements. Rust bloomed across the armour, orange and brown, spreading like a disease across surfaces that had once been military grey. Water collected inside the hull, accelerating the corrosion from within. The graffiti that soldiers had carved at Vaux-en-Amiénois began to blur and fade under layers of decay. The crowned lion that some triumphant Tommy had painted on the hull weathered and faded until you had to know it was there to see it. Battle damage remained visible. The shell holes, the dents and gouges from shrapnel, the marks of the recovery operation itself, scratches from cables, scrapes from being dragged through no man's land. All of it exposed to Brisbane's relentless climate, slowly deteriorating under sun and rain and the passage of decades. And children climbed on it. That's what people remember. If you grew up in Brisbane in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, if your parents or grandparents took you to the museum, you might have stood on Mephisto, run your hands over the armour, touched the battle damage, the shell holes, the dents and gouges from that night in July 1918 when it was dragged through no man's land under gas attack. Kids sat on the tracks, peered through the gun ports, climbed the hull like it was playground equipment. Because it was outside, accessible, real, not behind glass, not roped off. Just sitting there in the garden, rusting and weathering and waiting for the next generation to discover it. The size of it never left me, that's what people say. Grown adults who visited as children, who remember the overwhelming impression of standing next to something that massive, that heavy, that old. Their fathers pointed at shell holes and explained what they were. Their grandfathers, some of them, had been in France when the war was fought, had maybe even heard about the tank's recovery, had maybe known men in the 26th Battalion. The tank became a fixture, part of Brisbane's landscape, something people grew up with, grew old with, brought their own children to see. But it was also falling apart. Here's what nobody fully understood during those 60 years. This was the only one. The Germans built 20 A7Vs during the war. 20. The entire program. Supply shortages, competing priorities, bureaucratic delays. Germany never managed to produce tanks in meaningful numbers. By comparison, Britain and France manufactured thousands. Germany's armoured force was a historical footnote, an experiment that never scaled beyond a handful of prototypes. After the war ended, the remaining A7Vs were scrapped, most of them, nearly every one still in Germany. The country was disarming under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, and the tanks were melted down. Their steel went to peacetime uses: buildings, bridges, railroads, kitchen pots, for all anyone knows. The machines that had been Germany's answer to British and French armour simply ceased to exist. The few vehicles captured by the Allies met similar fates, studied for intelligence purposes, documented, photographed, and then destroyed once they'd served their analytical purpose. Elfriede, the first A7V captured, was examined by Allied intelligence. Other damaged vehicles were assessed and discarded. Except Mephisto. Lieutenant Colonel Robinson's decision in 1918, his insistence that this particular tank had historical value, his competitive determination that Queensland should claim it before the British did, had created the only exception, the only surviving example of Germany's first tank program. Not in Berlin, where it would have been scrapped under the treaty. Not in France or Britain, where it would have been examined and destroyed. In Brisbane, Queensland, rusting in a garden while children climbed on it. There are replicas now. Museums have built them for display and education. But there is only one original A7V on Earth. And it exists because a Queensland battalion commander looked at a mud-stuck tank behind enemy lines and decided the future should see what the war had created. By the time anyone fully grasped the significance of what they had, by the time people understood that Mephisto wasn't just a war trophy, but a singular artifact, the tank was in serious trouble. The decision to bring Mephisto indoors came after decades of deterioration that had left the tank in precarious condition. Conservation teams assessed the damage. 60-plus years of subtropical exposure had taken its toll. The tank had weathered decades of Brisbane's climate, the heat, the humidity, the monsoonal rains. Paint layers had accumulated and degraded over time, with the original German markings buried under subsequent editions and the graffiti of soldiers. Components were missing, either stripped during the original abandonment in 1918 or lost over the decades. The interior had suffered water damage from years of rain pooling on the hull and seeping through every gap. The restoration wasn't about making Mephisto look new. It was about stopping it from disappearing entirely. Specialists worked to stabilize the structure, halt the active corrosion, prevent further decay. They documented everything, every marking, every scratch, every trace of the history embedded in the metal. The goal was preservation, not restoration to factory condition. This tank had survived a battle, a recovery operation, a 10,000-mile journey, and 60 years of weather. All of that was part of its story. The rust told a story. The faded paint told a story. The battle damage told a story. Today, Mephisto sits at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, protected indoors. No more rain pooling on the hull. no more subtropical sun, no more children climbing on the armour, though the memories of those who did remain as vivid as the day they stood there. It's magnificent now, imposing, exactly as massive as you remember if you saw it as a child. 24 feet long, 10 feet wide, a steel box that weighs as much as a loaded semi-truck. The battle damage is still visible. The Mephisto name is still on the hull, and somewhere in the layers of paint and rust and restoration, you can still find traces of the men who carved their names into the armour at Vaux-en-Amiénois in 1918. Soldiers who had no idea they were marking the only one that would survive. And that's the thing about this story. If you grew up in Queensland, if you visited the museum with your parents or your school class, if you stood in front of Mephisto and felt something, that sense of awe, that overwhelming impression of size and weight and history, you weren't imagining it. You weren't wrong. You were standing in front of the only one on Earth. 20 A7Vs were built. All the others are gone. Every single one. Scrapped under the Treaty of Versailles, destroyed for intelligence purposes, melted down for peacetime steel, blown up by demolition teams, lost to history. And the reason this one survived isn't luck, it isn't accident. It's a chain of deliberate choices stretching back more than a century. Lieutenant Colonel James Alexander Robinson looked at a mud-stuck tank behind enemy lines and decided it mattered. Decided the future should see what the war had created. Decided that Queensland, not Britain, not France, not some European museum, should have it. Brigadier Evan Alexander Wisdom approved the operation, committing military resources to recover a historical artifact under enemy fire. 13 men volunteered for a gas-filled nightmare to drag it free. All of them ended up in hospital. 2 of them took bullets to the head. All of them survived. Someone put it on a rail car, then another rail car, then a ship across the Channel. Then another ship around the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean, 10,000 miles and 65 days of sailing. 2 steamrollers hauled it through Brisbane streets, gouging the roads, scraping the buildings, taking 11 hours to go less than 2 miles. And when it started to fall apart, when 60 years of weather had eaten into the armour, when the rust was spreading, when the paint was flaking away, people fought to save it again, brought it indoors, stabilized it, preserved what remained. That's not luck. That's a century of people deciding that this thing mattered. The size of it never leaves you. That's what people say. I clearly remember my dad showing me the battle damage. The size of it never left me. These are real memories. Valid memories. You stood in front of something that shouldn't exist. A survivor against all odds, preserved by human stubbornness, shipped halfway around the world because a Queensland colonel decided the future should see what the war had created. The tank that Heinz Theunissen named after a devil. The tank that got stuck in a shell crater and changed hands between empires. The tank that travelled further after its abandonment than it ever did under its own power. Mephisto didn't roll to Australia, but the story of how it got here is even more improbable than if it had. The last A7V on Earth sits in a museum in Canberra, the Australian War Memorial. It spent most of a century in Queensland, first in the garden, weathering, while children climbed on it and the rust spread. Now indoors, preserved, waiting for the next generation to stand in front of it and feel what everyone who came before them felt. That sense of scale, that weight of history, that impossible improbability of a German tank built in 1917, abandoned in 1918, sitting in Australia today. If you've never seen it, go. Stand where thousands of Australians have stood. Look at the shell holes. Read the name painted on the hull. Try to imagine 18 men crammed inside, the heat, the noise, the terror of advancing into artillery fire with a 10-meter blind spot ahead. If you have seen it, if you're one of the people who remembers touching the armor as a child, who remembers your father explaining the battle damage, who remembers the overwhelming impression of size, you already understand. Some things stick with you, and some things are worth saving. Subscribe for more stories like this.